As Lent draws to a close and Easter Sunday approaches, I think it's interesting to think about the narrative from a number of different angles. As we've talked about in our AC Lent series, Lent marks a time of 40 days of contemplation and prayer and fasting. But what exactly is it that we're contemplating on? Well, I want you to back up with me for a second and think about the circumstances surrounding the Easter story. Jesus is handed over to the authorities and the disciples hide. They hide because they're scared. The religious leaders have orchestrated the death of Jesus and they fear that they're next. The women come across a little more positively in the story, going to the tomb, but they're not expecting a resurrection any more than the scared disciples are. That is, despite Jesus constantly stating that he's going to do that. But the women show up at the tomb to literally perfume the corpse of the author of life. In one sense, life is a communally transmitted, always fatal, no cure condition that we all suffer from. And despite the fact that every single one of us will die, we all feel an awkwardness when it happens, don't we? The strangeness of knowing that this person, you can close your eyes and picture their face, or have their voice in your head, you can hear it, or remember the times you had with them, that they are gone. It's an interesting thought, isn't it? In the face of death, all we really know how to do is, like the women at the tomb, mask the scent of it. And those first century followers, the last thing that they expect is for Jesus to rise from the dead. And so Mary shows up at the tomb and there's confusion. The body is missing, things seem awry, and then all of a sudden, Mary hears a voice from behind her, calling her name, and there's instant joy. The author J.R.R. Tolkien coined the term eucatastrophe, eu being the Greek prefix meaning good, and I think you can figure out catastrophe. But Tolkien's point in using this phrase is to capture an event where there is such a 180 turn of events in a story that it ensures the main character not only doesn't end up in what looks like unavoidable doom, but we're instead given a situation where we experience joy on behalf of the protagonist or the situation. In Tolkien's Lord of the Rings, at the very end, when Frodo finally gets to Mount Doom to destroy the Ring of Power, he's standing on the precipice. The flames of the volcano are leaking at his heels, and in that moment, Frodo decides not to destroy the ring. Instead, he becomes consumed by the deceptive lust of power that is the ring, desiring to claim it for himself. And it's at that very moment that the half-crazed Gollum suddenly appears, snatching the ring from Frodo's hand, and in his ecstatic gloating, falls into the fire. You know, for a split second, the reader might have thought that the Dark Lord Sauron had won. All was for naught. And yet, at that very moment, Tolkien inserts a eucatastrophe. Christ's triumph over death is the ultimate eucatastrophe. Death, this thing that has the final call on all of our lives, our dreams, our hopes, our aspirations, what seemingly stops Jesus' fruitful and thriving ministry in its tracks, all of that is flipped on its head. The UK evangelist Glenn Scrivener describes the narrative of every worldview here on earth as some form of survival of the fittest. Christianity, he says, differs because instead of the strong being on top, then the hierarchy of those who are fittest triumphing religiously or ideologically or politically, so on and so forth, instead of that survival of the fittest mantra and narrative of the gospel. The gospel, the eucatastrophe of Easter, is that the fittest steps down into humanity to get his hands dirty and sacrifices himself for the survival of the weakest. Because of that fact, we can echo Paul when he writes to the church in Corinth saying, "Where, O death, is your victory? Where, O death, is your sting?" That's what we contemplate during Lent, and that's what we celebrate during Easter.